Okay, welcome folks to this evening's public review session. My name is Jerry Bogaz. I'm an assistant director with the staff of the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council. We are in the midst of a 30-day public comment period for moving forward, which is NMTC's draft regional transportation plan. That comment period will expire on July 27th. As part of that comment period, we're doing public review sessions on 3 dates, July 8th, 14th, and 22nd. This is the second session on July 14th. On all those dates, we had 2 sessions, one at noon and one at 7 p.m. And you'll notice that on the slide that's up on the screen right now, there is a link to a web portal that contains summary information about the plan, as well as directs users to each of the plan chapters and appendices. So we encourage you to use that link. You can also submit comments via that link. We will be using an interactive platform tonight. We're going to be trying to give you a flavor of the plan tonight and guide you to what information is contained in the plan. But there will be use of an interactive platform to gather any thoughts you might have in terms of the plan document and any comments you wanted to submit now. But if you don't submit any comments tonight, again, the comment period is open until 4 p.m. on July 27th. I do want to acknowledge Jan Kahn, who is on the session. Jan is our regional planning manager, and he and his staff have worked with our member agencies for more than 2 years to develop this plan and did a great job doing that. I also wanted to point out that there's an awful lot of information contained in the plan, much of it required by the federal government. So we'll hopefully be giving you a flavor of that information tonight, but there's really no way in a 90-minute session to cover all the points that are contained in the plan. So you get a good primer tonight, and then you'll be able to look more deeply into the plan if you so desire. Having said that, I'm going to turn the session over to Jessica Ortiz, and she's going to take you through some instructions. Jessica?
Thank you, Jerry. So hi, my name is Jessica Ortiz. I'll be the second voice you hear throughout the presentation. I wanted to take a moment to walk everyone through the WebEx platform that we will be using tonight. If you're accessing the meeting from a computer, the screens and buttons will look very similar to the image on this slide. The placement of the features will be different depending on the device you're using. So if you're using a cell phone, the buttons and the way the screen looks will look similar but different. There will be 2 button features that I wanted to point out. The first is the mute button. As you've already noticed, you have been placed on mute. This is to reduce the background noise and to minimize interruptions to the presentation. You will be muted throughout the entire presentation, and we ask that you please stay on mute. The comments we collect today will be addressed in the final plan, and today we will be collecting comments in 2 ways. The first is by using the chat button. Once you have selected the chat button, and that's the button at the bottom of your screen, you will be able to type your comments in the message window on the left-hand side and submit those comments to the chat message board. The second way that you will be able to provide your comments on what is presented and this overview is by using the Poll Everywhere software. And we've placed question prompts throughout the presentation to collect your comments. To respond to the questions, you can visit pollev.com/NMTC. My colleague Marisol has just placed a link in the chat window to help you access the Poll Everywhere platform. And so the way that you access the Poll Everywhere platform is by going to pollev.com/NMTC and then respond to those questions and prompts. So now that you've taken a moment to access Poll Everywhere, let's move to that first question. So we're really interested in where you came from today or where you're participating from. So we have a map here, and the way that this interactive polling question works is that you just select the place on the map where you are participating from, and we will be able to see a pin. So it's as if you're dropping a pin on the map to let us know where you're from. So I'll give you all a few moments to access Poll Everywhere and to place a pin on the map. I see somebody has placed a pin on Queens. So they're participating from Queens today. I see somebody has placed a pin on the Bronx. So there's a participant from the Bronx today. And I'll give you all just a couple more moments to place your pins and place your locations. So we'll move on to the next question. We're also very interested in how you found out about these public review sessions. So we have a couple of multiple choice responses here, and you're able to select one response. And those responses are you heard about the meeting through email, by snail mail, through NIMTIC Notes or NIMTIC newsletter, through a media release that we sent to the press, through social media, either via Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. We also want to acknowledge that word of mouth is a way that people hear about meetings. So we have that as an option. And there may be another way that you heard about the meeting. Maybe a friend sent you a text message or something. So we've placed an other category for those kinds of ways that people have heard about the meeting. And just as a note, if on your screen you're still seeing the previous question, I would suggest that you refresh your browser and you'll be able to see the most recent question on your screen. So I'll give it just a couple more minutes before we move on. Okay, and let's move on to the ground rules. So as I've mentioned, we are, except for the presenters, everyone is muted today just to minimize the background noise distractions. We're collecting comments in two ways, via Poll Everywhere and the chat window. And so we'll respond to those comments in the final plan document. And of course, this public meeting is being recorded for those who are not able to attend the meeting tonight. But we will also have, as Jerry mentioned, 2 more meetings on the 22nd at noon and at 7 p.m. So now I'll hand it back to Jerry.
Thanks, Jessica. So we're going to move into now providing you some contextual information so that you can understand the role of the plan in the overall process and how this process brings federal dollars into our region for transportation improvements. Next slide, Jessica. The objectives of these sessions, and I touched on this a little bit before, but so we're providing information about the plan and also the congestion management process, which accompanies the plan. You'll get information about both those items. Hold on. We are directing participants to additional information and documentation should you want to dig deeper into a particular topic before you submit a comment before July 27th. We're also collecting public commentary in these sessions for formal response in the final plan document, as Jessica indicated. If you have any comments or any thoughts, you can provide them tonight. And we are directing participants to avenues for further commentary during the comment period. So we understand if comments aren't forthcoming tonight, we're at least going to give you a bit of background on the plan and where it fits and how you can look, as I said, for more details before you do submit comments. Next slide. So one way, the important way to understand the plan is to understand the planning process and what the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council is and how this whole process fits. So we're going to show you a short video that's going to give you some of that overview information. Jessica, no sound. Still none, Jessica.
Jessica, you probably muted yourself.
That is correct. Sorry about that, everyone. You would think after a year I'd get this right. Sorry about that. Thanks, Jack.
Welcome to NMTIC, the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council. Established in 1982, NMTIC is the metropolitan planning organization for New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. Our 10-county region includes the 5 boroughs of New York City, plus Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, Putnam, and Rockland counties, and is home to more than 12 million people. NMTIC's principals include 9 voting members and 7 advisory members, comprised of 5 suburban county executives, 2 New York City commissioners, the New York State Transportation Commissioner, and the chief executive of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Advisory members include the New York State Commissioner of Environmental Conservation, the chief executives of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Transit, and the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, and the local administrators of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Highway Administration, and the Federal Transit Administration. Federal legislation requires that metropolitan regions must have a Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, to plan for and make decisions on the use of federal transportation funding. Approximately $10 to $15 billion of federal funding comes into the region during each 5-year funding period. NMTIC ensures that existing and future spending for transportation projects and programs is based on a cooperative, comprehensive, and continuing planning process. The state and local officials who comprise NMTIC have a shared vision, recognizing that mobility, the ability of people and goods to move easily and safely to, from, and between locations, is crucial to the lives of people of all abilities who live in, work in, or visit the NMTIC planning region. Therefore, we aspire to ensure that the mobility provided reaches everyone in a sustainable, healthy, and equitable manner, to invest efficiently for these transportation needs, and to respond effectively to changes in transportation needs and capabilities. Moving forward is the next long-range regional transportation plan for the NMTIC region. Updated every 4 years, the Regional Transportation Plan is a blueprint that helps identify the transportation needs in NMTIC's planning area in order to guide the use of federal funding. NMTIC's plan covers all modes of surface transportation, including highways, roads and bridges, streets, rail and bus transit, bicycle and pedestrian facilities, as well as freight and special needs transportation. Our region is facing difficult challenges. Despite that, looking to the future is as important as ever for the region's long-term vitality. Moving Forward proposes a regional vision that is built around 5 strategic goals. To provide a transportation system that ensures the safety and security of people and goods across all transportation uses and modes. To provide a transportation system that is maintained, operated, and coordinated to better enable inclusive, reliable, easy, accessible, and seamless travel across the region, while striving for enhanced equity in the services provided. To provide a transportation system that efficiently serves today's population and plans for the growing number of residents, workers, and increasing amount of goods. To provide a transportation system that minimizes its greenhouse gas emissions and other impacts on the environment, especially the effects of climate change. And to provide a transportation system that is resilient and can mitigate, adapt to, and respond to chronic and acute stresses and disruptions. As NMTIC pursues these goals through our regional transportation planning process, the following guiding principles inform our planning. We will consider the needs of all users across NMTIC's planning area as a whole in the planning process. We will make the best use of federal resources for the regional transportation system and increase them where practical, while leveraging local resources as efficiently and effectively as possible. We will monitor the performance of the regional transportation system as a means of prioritizing improvements and investments. We will support multi-agency approaches that enhance the integration of independently operated components of the regional transportation system. We will engage the public and community stakeholders. And we will harness technological advancements to improve our transportation system. People living in the NMTIC region are very aware of how their transportation system works and where it needs improvement. What transportation improvements are important to you? What matters most to your community? Your input is critical as we continue planning for our region's transportation needs. So how can you get involved? Attend a public workshop or provide your thoughts through our website or social media channels. Visit our website to join our mailing list, register for a workshop, and more. So get involved. Together, we can keep our region moving forward.
Okay, so with that as a bit of overview about what this organization is and what role it plays along with its planning products, we're showing you now what the process is. This is the required process that the federal government puts into place in order for a region to be eligible for federal funding. And it starts in the middle of the upper section, the orange circle, with the regional transportation plan, which is really foundational. It's long-term. It defines long-range needs. We move through other required products such as the Unified Planning Work Program, which directs federal planning money into our region to look at studies and to define projects and programs and things that need to be implemented. And then we turn the corner around to the Transportation Improvement Program, which is a 5-year program of specific transportation improvements that will be receiving federal dollars. And that really is the first 5 years of the plan in many ways, and it's where the projects actually get identified. These could be roadway projects, these could be transit purchases, these could be transit facilities. It's basically all surface transportation that is eligible for this funding. There is a requirement after that for us to analyze the results of the plan and the program, and that analysis takes the form of a congestion management process and a regional emissions analysis. And then you turn the corner back up to the blue circle that says project planning and implementation. That's what everyone is striving to get to, so that we've identified the needs, we've identified the resources, we've identified what we need to do, and now we're implementing projects. And all the members of NIMTIC are basically in agreement as to what those key projects are using federal dollars. So this is the overall planning process that we're required to follow. It brings in those $10 to $15 billion of federal money every 5-year period. Next slide, please. So the plan is federally required. It's that foundational planning product, and it looks at a minimum 20-year time frame. We usually do more than 20 years. This particular plan actually covers 29 federal fiscal years from fiscal 22 through fiscal 50. It needs to be updated every 4 years. That's a requirement. And it really is a blueprint that guides federal funding and is developed collaboratively amongst our members, other interested agencies, stakeholders throughout the region, and interested organizations, as well as the interested public. Next slide. It does cover all modes of surface transportation from a regional perspective, as the video said, including, as you can see at the end, goods movement, human services transportation being part of those different modes. And it addresses key transportation activities, such as operations and management of the system, safety and security of the system, and regional finances. Next slide. So what we're doing now is required public comment. But before we even had a draft plan, we did a very ambitious program of public outreach to gather information about what the draft plan should contain. That was last year. It was June through September of 2020. It was originally scheduled to begin in March of 2020, but of course we all know what happened in March of 2020, and that caused us to really rethink the entire process using virtual techniques as opposed to in-person techniques. And you can see the range of those techniques that was used, starting with online regional workshops, an online engagement platform that was available for that entire period, 24/7, online focus groups with specific groups. We advertised these activities through social media, and we also work with local partner organizations in our 3 subregions, Long Island, New York City, and the Hudson Valley, to spread the word about the outreach program. And finally, there was a pulse survey of about 1,000 respondents that was used. So overall, we talked to over 4,000 people in this outreach program, and we gathered a huge amount of information that was considered by our member agencies as they developed the draft that you're considering tonight. Next slide. So the future needs is sort of foundation piece of the plan itself. So we're defining here likely future conditions in terms of population, employment, and travel. And of course, these are all critical bases for the plan itself. Next slide. We start off with some socioeconomic and demographic forecasts for metrics such as population, employment, labor force, and number of households. These are all key metrics for generating travel forecasts. These metrics are forecasted in 5-year intervals and out to the plan's horizon. Next slide. We do this for a 31 county geography. So we're not just forecasting for the 10 counties of the NMTIC planning area, but we're also looking at 31 counties in 3 states surrounding New York City. So those include subregions such as New York City, Long Island, Lower and Mid Hudson Valley, Northern New Jersey, and Southwestern Connecticut. Next slide. Now, COVID-19 has obviously played a role since last year, and the pandemic has had huge impacts on short-term trends that we've been following for many years. So adjustments were made to these forecasts to reflect this short-term impact and the short-term uncertainty that the pandemic has brought on. But the primary purpose of the forecast is the long-term outlook, and that is less susceptible to short-term volatility. So although if you look at the details behind the forecasts in the plan, you'll see that there's a definite effect of the pandemic on the forecast. Generally, still, we're talking about long-term growth that's been forecast, which you'll see shortly. Next slide. So I guess, Jessica, we're going to move over to the web portal and show these statistics. So these are just some of the forecasts that we have done for the plan. If we look at the base year of 2017, you can see almost 13 million population in our planning area, employment at just over 7 million, just under 7 million civilian labor force, and average household size at 2.75 people. We look at 2050 in comparison, we're forecasting significant growth to over 14 million people in the planning area, over 8 million employment, 7.25 million for civilian labor force, and a reduced average household size down to 2.71. That household size is important because that really is a driver of travel in many ways. And here's the difference between the two, and this is the type of growth that's being forecast: just over 10% increase in population, close to 14% in employment, 11% or so in civilian labor force, and a dropping average household size. So this gives you a flavor of the types of forecasts, socioeconomic and demographic forecasts that are critical to also forecasting travel. And Jessica, we can go to the next slide. And here is a summary of the travel forecasts that have come out of this process using the SED forecast as a basis. You can see increases in total daily trips, daily auto trips, larger proportional increase in daily transit trips, daily vehicle miles of travel, or VMT, increased, and daily vehicle hours of travel. Now, we use a complex simulation model to produce these travel forecasts, and the socioeconomic demographic forecasts are input into that model. And obviously, there's a lot more detail than this summary that comes out of the model. A lot of that information is contained in the plan itself. But the bottom line is the future is challenging. We all know that our transportation system is congested in many ways right now, and we're looking at potential future growth that will put even more stress on the system. That is a challenge. If you go to the next slide, we also looked at what the future might hold for goods movement, because that also stresses the transportation system. We're seeing growth in many of the different movements that happen for goods in our region, both coming into the region, going out of the region, traveling around our planning area, and also traveling through our planning area. And we also are aware of the fact that these are pre-COVID forecasts, and that COVID itself has changed the business model for a number of retail organizations, and put a greater emphasis on home delivery and online shopping, which means that that generates even more demand for delivery trips, truck trips, and so forth. So looking at the area of goods, we see the same types of stresses that we see in growth in general, stresses on the transportation system. Next slide. As we considered these forecasts, we looked at what transformative change might happen within the period of the plan. And there's significant potential transformative change. And you can see some of the factors and drivers here. Obviously, the pandemic is driving change, but there are also changes in personal mobility, the evolution of shared mobility. Technology is developing in ways that is altering how transportation is provided and consumed. E-commerce and distribution innovations are changing the way goods move. And technologies such as distributed manufacturing, also known as 3D printing, may in the future make a big impact on whether goods are moved or whether they're produced in a more distributed fashion. So all these drivers of transformative change were assessed in the plan in the context of our future forecasts. Next slide. We also looked at large-scale disruptors, and looking at that, these are generally outside of the area of transportation, but they affect transportation. Things like climate change and extreme weather events, the transformation of the energy industry and our sources of energy, changing demographics and lifestyle, work style expectations, and we understand that there's an awful lot of unknowns about, particularly that work style expectation, because of the pandemic, and how coming out of the pandemic, work styles may change more quickly than we originally anticipated. And there are changing land use patterns that are resulting from it. So these large-scale disruptors also are at play as we consider our forecasts into the future. Next slide. So the assumed impacts of all this are outlined in the plan. It's likely that the impacts of these changes and these disruptors will not have a huge impact on plan's forecasts in the first 10 years of the plan. But if you look beyond that, there is a good deal more uncertainty about their impacts, but it's not yet possible to really quantify when and where and how these impacts will occur. So the best we can do is qualitatively say that beyond the first 10 years of the plan, there could be some significant variability in terms of what we forecasted and what actually may happen. Next slide. So we're going to go back to an interactive exercise with Jessica.
Great, thanks, Jerry. So we have here an open-ended question that we're asking you all, specifically if you have any comments or observations on the scale of the growth forecast that Jerry just presented. And the way you can respond to this question is either by just providing your initial reaction in one word, or you can write a couple sentences about specifically about the scale of the growth forecast. So I'll give everyone a moment or two to provide those responses. And again, if you do not see this question on your screen, you see the previous question on your screen, then I would suggest that you refresh your browser. And also to those who joined a little bit later in the presentation, we just want to direct you to pollev.com/NIMTIC to participate in this polling activity. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next question. And this is another open-ended question, and it asks if you have any observations or comments on the adjustments we've made for COVID-19. So that could be any comments about the shift to virtual for public outreach, or more specifically, the SED forecast short-term adjustments that were made. So if you, once again, you can write just a stream of thought into this open-ended question, or you can also add one word that captures your reaction to the adjustments that we've made for COVID-19. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the, oh, yes, Jerry?
I just wanted to point out that, you may not be ready to comment this evening, and that's understood. We're still going to ask these questions and give the opportunity, but there is still time to provide comments, not only on these questions, but on everything in the plan through July 27th. So not an issue if you don't feel you can comment tonight, or if you don't want to use the poll everywhere, you can always put something in the chat pod also. Go ahead, Jessica.
And then, so we'll go on to our third open-ended question for this section of the presentation. It's just requesting comments for the consideration of transformative change. And those could be anything that Jerry had mentioned in the previous slides about the e-commerce shifts that we've seen because of the pandemic, or just because e-commerce has been popular in general, or the distribution changes in e-printing. And again, as Jerry mentioned, you can review any of the topics presented in the presentation tonight at the Moving Forward website, and you have until July 27th to provide your comments.
Okay, let's go on to the next topic. So we're going to move into really the guts of the plan in many ways, which is the members' shared vision for the future and their mutual interests in the transportation system and the regional, the health of the region. And this really lays out a lot of the framework for what the plan is proposing. It includes a shared vision. And that shared vision identifies goals, which we heard in the video, and various objectives, and we'll be talking about them quickly for each of the 5 vision goals. So next slide. So the shared vision statement that's in the plan begins with this preamble that the officials that comprise NMTIC recognize that mobility, the ability of people and goods to move easily and safely to, from, and between locations is crucial to the lives of everyone who resides in, works in, or visits within the NMTIC planning region. And therefore, based on that, when the officials come together as NMTIC, they aspire to, as you can see, to ensure that the mobility provided reaches everyone in a sustainable, healthy, and equitable manner. They aspire to invest efficiently for these transportation needs, and they aspire to respond effectively to the transportation challenges of tomorrow. So that is in fact the preamble to the vision statement. Next slide. Next, they identified the 5 vision goals, which you heard about in the video: safety and security, reliable and easy travel, planning for changing demand, reducing environmental impacts, and resiliency. And that it really provides a strategic framework for the plan and the planning process. Next slide. You also heard in the video about the identification of guiding principles. So as these goals are pursued, these guiding principles also provide a framework for the activities that are pursued through the goal to get to the goals, to realize the goals. Considering the needs of all users, making the best use of federal resources, monitoring performance, supporting multi-agency approaches, engaging the public, and harnessing technological advancements. So we're going to stop here and do another quick interactive exercise on this vision framework. Jessica?
Thanks, Jerry. So this kind of question is a ranking question. And so what we're asking is for you to rank in your relative importance the vision goals. And so you'll see on your Poll Everywhere platform just each of the 5 goals. And so you'll select one of those goals and you'll see an up and down arrow, and you'll be able to organize them in your preferred ranking. So again, we have the 5 vision goals that Jerry mentioned: safety and security, reliable and easy travel, planning for changing demand, reducing environmental impacts, and resiliency. And so I'll give everybody a couple of moments to provide their rankings of the vision goals. Okay, and I'm going to move on to the next question. And so this question is another ranking question, and it asks you to rank the guiding principles in terms of your relative importance. And so these guiding principles are shortened, a shortened version of the guiding principles that you heard in the video. And so they are the consideration of the needs of all users, considering the needs of all users, the best use of federal resources, monitoring performance, supporting multi-agency approaches, engaging the public, and harnessing technological advancements. So I'll give everybody a moment to provide their rank order. Okay. And so this next question is just another open-ended question, and it asks you to provide any and all comments, reactions, observations on the 5 vision goals under the 6 guiding principles that we just outlined in these previous slides. And so again, if you can provide this in a one-word response, a couple of sentences, but if you think of something throughout the presentation related to the 5 vision goals and the 6 guiding principles, you can still provide your comment in the chat message board. So I'll give everyone a moment to provide any comments if they have any related to the 5 vision goals or the 6 guiding principles. Okay, and I'll hand it back to Jerry.
Okay, very good. So we have organized this part of the plan around these modules for each of the vision goals. And really these modules contain a description of the goal beyond what the statement is, related objectives, a scan of recent trends and current conditions and existing initiatives related to the goal, as well as recommended strategies and actions related to the goal and performance metrics. And so we're going to go through these rather quickly, give you a flavor of them. Again, there's a lot of information in each of these modules that we can't go through in detail right now in a 90-minute session, but it is online and available through the plan itself if you want to take a look at it. So next slide. So for the first vision goal, safety and security, you can see the objectives here. Investing in physical assets, promoting safe streets and intersections, keeping the system secure from threats, coordinating safety management, training, and education across jurisdictional borders, and improving the safety and security of system operations. So those are the objectives that were defined for this particular goal by our members. The next slide will show you information about what the scan contains, including some of the trends that are in the scan, some of the current conditions that are described, and a range of existing initiatives related to this particular goal. Next slide. The recommended strategies and actions fall into these categories: planning and research initiatives, data collection, forecasting, and performance assessment, planning process recommendations, and program recommendations, which are organized in 2 areas: regional guidance programs and education and training programs. Next slide. Oh, by the way, go back one. I'm sorry, Jessica. So the details of what's in each of these categories are available through that link at the bottom of the page that links into the web portal. And again, we don't have the time to go through each and every strategy and action that's proposed, but you can certainly visit that page and see what those details are. Okay, Jessica, next slide. And these are finally the performance metrics that are proposed to be associated with that goal: a number of fatalities, fatality rate, number of serious injuries, serious injury rate, and then non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, and public transportation fatalities, injuries, and safety events. So that is the first module for safety and security. And we're going to ask you if you have any comments on that. Jessica?
Great, thanks, Jerry. So as Jerry mentioned, this is the opportunity to just provide any comments on the safety and security module. So that could be any comments on the objectives for the module, for the safety and security module, as well as any comments that you may have on the brief list of existing initiatives that we provided on that slide. You can also, if you have any reactions to the recommended strategy and action categories, maybe the programs section, the regional program or the educational programs, as well as any of the performance metrics that Jerry outlined a moment ago. So I'll give you all a second or two or a minute or two to provide any comments if you have them. And acknowledging that we quickly went over this module, and we'll quickly go over the next 4 vision goals. We encourage you to go to the plan website and review those a bit more in depth and provide your comments on our website on our comment form before July 27th. So I'll move on now.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So next goal is reliable and easy travel. Here are the 8 objectives that were identified for this. Rebuilding, replacing, and modernizing assets, improving first and last mile access to transit, providing more frequent and reliable transit service, improving accessibility to the transportation system in general for users of all abilities, investing in improving the integration of the multimodal transit network, improving the integration of freight modes and facilities, investing in collecting and sharing quality transportation data, and promoting equitable transportation and workplace access, regardless of age, race, ability, ethnicity, or income. So these are the 8 objectives identified for this particular goal. The next slide gives you a scan of the trends and conditions, current risks, and existing initiatives that were looked at for this goal. I would call your attention to the first 2 under current risks, the aging transportation system and the availability of funding. We have an extensive transportation system for all modes, and it tends to be quite old. And it puts a lot of pressure on the funding resources in terms of preserving that system as well as expanding it strategically. Next slide. The strategies and actions fall into these categories. The first 3 are familiar to you because you saw them in the previous call. But the program recommendations are organized into transit access programs, transit service enhancement programs, and freight access programs. And again, there's the link at the bottom that will take you to the detailed section of the plan that describes all of the proposed strategies and actions. And finally, the last slide are the performance metrics. You can see them here. They have to do with the condition of the infrastructure, pavement, bridges, and transit. Those are the performance metrics identified for this goal. So we're going to do a quick request about if there are any comments on that particular goal module. And if there are none, we're going to move forward from there.
Yep, so we'll just give everybody a couple seconds.
Yep. All right, let's move on. The next goal is planning for changing demand. You can see the objectives here. Investing in system capacity, expanding the reach of the system to underserved communities and emerging markets, encouraging a number of non-motorized and sustainable strategies, or sustainability strategies, I should say, modernizing local freight networks, and incorporating emerging and innovative transportation services and tools. So those are the 5 objectives identified by the members for this particular goal. The next slide shows the results of the scan, the trends we're looking at in this particular goal module, the current risks and conditions, and the existing initiatives related to this. And finally, we get to recommended strategies and actions. Notable here is, again, the program recommendations. In that category, they are organized by Complete Streets programs. Complete Streets are streets that provide facilities and access for all modes, not just motorized modes, transit access programs, and shared mobility programs. Shared mobility is really increasing sector of transportation where essentially the conveyances are shared by people generally, and that's how the mobility is provided. You're talking about bike shares, car shares, and even shared forms of ride-hailing services. Next slide. Here are the performance metrics that are identified for this goal: vehicle miles of travel per capita, person hours of delay, public transportation system reliability, and then several ratios that indicate reliability of travel given the existence of congestion and so forth, increased demand. So we're going to ask if there are any comments on this particular goal, set of objectives, scan, and proposed measures and metrics.
And to those who are joining us a little bit late in the presentation, you can participate via pollev.com/NMTIC or by placing your comment in the chat message window. Okay, so.
Okay, moving on, Jessica. This is the third goal area, reducing environmental impact. Or is this the fourth?
This is the fourth.
I'm losing track, yes. So there are 6 objectives here: encouraging alternatives to single occupant vehicle trips, encouraging lower emissions alternatives to trucking, modernizing fleets to higher standard and lower emission vehicles, efficiently managing limited roadway capacity, promoting responsible environmental stewardship in transportation projects, and addressing unequal impacts of transportation emissions on communities. 6 objectives for this particular goal. This is the scan area. The trends tend to be focused here on measuring air pollutants. You have criteria air pollutants, which are identified under the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, greenhouse gases, and of course the travel, the vehicle miles of travel, that is a major generator of these emissions. And you can see the existing initiatives. The first one there is of note: Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, unique to New York State, was passed in the last several years and is slowly ramping up to try to have an impact on future levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the next slide, Jessica, will show some information on that. Yes, so here we just highlighted these trends because they're really relevant to this particular goal. On the left, you see trends related to greenhouse gas emissions, which tend to be moderating, but only slightly. And then on the right, you see that the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act calls for economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reductions from 1990 levels of 40% by 2030, and no less than 85% by 2050. And that will obviously need to include a contribution and reduction from the transportation sector. I believe the blue bars on the chart on the left are the emissions from the transportation sector. Next slide. Interestingly, though, in looking at the current conditions here, vehicular travel, when you compare the New York City urbanized area with other major urbanized areas around the country, has the most population. And as you can see in the second item, the daily vehicle miles of travel per capita is actually among the lowest. And it does show that there is a good level of efficiency in our system because the transit component of our system really incorporates a huge number of trips into transit as opposed to travel by vehicle. Even so, if you go one more column over to the right, you can see that our travel time index, which really shows how much additional delay there is in travel, as that number gets higher, that ratio gets higher, there's more delay over a usual level of travel time. That's still pretty high. So even though we have an extensive transit system that really draws in many trips, there's still a lot of trips out there that are congesting the roadways and so forth. So this is an interesting example of the efficiency of our system, but yet there are still issues to contend with. This particular slide really underscores the impact of the transit system in that comparing to the top 10 urbanized areas, transit ridership, you can see the transit ridership of our urbanized area on the bottom is far and away the greatest of all of them. by a large extent, several, I would say 200 to 300% higher. And this really underscores why our system tends to be efficient, but does not necessarily, because of our size, reduce, or rather totally mitigate, not reduce, mitigate the congestion that's still experienced despite that transit system. Next slide. So here are the recommended strategies and actions for this particular goal, and notable under program recommendations. We have community planning programs, commuting alternative programs, public messaging and marketing programs, vehicle emissions programs, and innovative materials programs. And again, there's a link at the bottom to the details of those strategies and actions. And the metrics that have been identified for this goal include the next slide, which are basically air pollutant levels for the criteria air pollutants under the Clean Air Amendments and the greenhouse gas inventory levels, as well as the indicators of travel, vehicle miles of travel, vehicle hours of delay. And I think at this point, we're going to find out if there are any comments on this particular module. If there are not, we're going to move on to the last.
That's correct. And this is an opportunity to comment on any portion of what was just presented. So it could be about the objectives or the performance metrics, or even the trend highlights that Jerry went over.
All right, let's move on. The final goal of the 5 is resiliency. And the objectives here are to protect and fortify the assets, continue to invest in sea level rise and climate change risk analyses, improve regional coordination on emergency and long-term responses, and finally enhance the network's resiliency by increasing travel options and redundancies. So these are the 4 objectives identified for this particular goal. Here's what's being scanned, and you'll notice under trends, you have obviously environmental and climate stressors, which are a big part of resiliency, but there are also human stressors here, things like cyber attacks, things like terrorism. These have had impacts in our region and can impact the transportation system. And of course, now we're seeing that there public health emergencies can play a huge role, either in terms of a global pandemic or in smaller epidemics that have happened over the last 50 to 75 years in our region. So those are some key trends that we're looking at for this particular goal. Next slide. Recommended strategies and actions, you'll note under planning and research, research recommendations is a particular category or subcategory. And, obtaining and monitoring the data that can indicate things like what's happening with sea level rise, the impacts of extreme weather events, and so forth. It's really an important part of this particular goal module. Those data are not as readily available as many of the other data that are used in our planning process, and that needs to be increased. And finally, the metrics we're looking at. Essentially, this is looking at the vulnerable transportation system given projected sea level rise and the impacts of extreme weather in terms of lane miles, bridges, transit services, trailways. What is the vulnerable system? And then key to that is once you've identified that system in terms of its scope, is what percentage of that system has been hardened against some of these stressors. So those are the performance metrics that are identified for this particular goal. And we're going to ask if there are any comments on this goal. And if not, we're going to move on into the final part of this session tonight. Okay, so we are required to identify how we're going to pay for the plan that we've drafted. If we go to the next slide, you can see the federal requirements here. So they require a financial plan that's part of the overall plan. And that includes system level estimates of costs and revenues reasonably expected to be available, estimates of the funds that will be available for the implementation of the plan, and additional financing strategies for the implementation of the plan as they are needed. We have identified 3 categories of costs and revenues. One is for operations and maintenance of the system, that's day-to-day operations and maintenance. The second is preserving the system, achieving and maintaining a state of good repair. And the third is enhancing the system strategically. I'm just going to show you some summaries of some of the information so you get a sense of the amounts we're talking about here over a 29-year period. On the left, we have the costs for operation and maintenance over the period of the plan, which exceeds $900 billion in year of expenditure dollars, which is a required inflationary estimate. Federal regulations require that the amounts be inflated to the year that they're actually going to be used. What you can see here is the predominance of the MTA system in terms of operations and maintenance, given the scale of the MTA system. Much smaller slices for the individual counties, the city, and the state's parts of the system. On the right-hand side, you can see how we've estimated and forecast what resources will be available to meet these operations and maintenance needs. These numbers are not exactly equal, but they're close enough to establish in the long term that resources should be sufficient to meet these operations and maintenance needs for both transit and for highways. And these are based on forecasts that are based on the operating budgets of the member agencies that have jurisdiction over these systems. Next slide. System preservation enhancement costs. On the left, you can see the system preservation costs forecasted out through 2050 for the federally supported system. That is the majority of the transportation system that is eligible for federal funding. There are some components of our system that are owned and operated by self-financed public authorities, like the Port Authority, and those components of the system make very little use, if any use, of federal dollars. They're not considered to be part of the federally supported transportation system. But the majority of the system is, and that's what these estimates are for. You can see, again, the predominance of transit in those system preservation costs, and less so for pavements and bridges. The total cost here being about $750 billion with a B over the life of the plan. On top of that, we have about $50 billion on the right-hand side for strategic system enhancements. That includes, in the very first line item there, minor system enhancements, which are less than $100 million. And then itemized below that are major system enhancements that are $100 million or more. So there is an attempt to, within the projection of reasonably available resources, to identify strategic system enhancements that will improve the system's ability to meet future demand. Next slide. And then finally, this is an itemization of the resources that are estimated to be available for plan implementation. I would note and call your attention to the orange box in the upper right, which shows that the federal dollars, the federal component, about $160 billion, very important to our region, but highly leveraged. That only equals about 20% of the resources that are forecast to be reasonably available to implement the plan. The other 80% are state and local resources. So those federal dollars are very important to our region. We don't certainly want to do without them, but they're highly leveraged against state and local resources. Next slide. And then the plan does go into additional financing strategies, public-private partnerships, value capture, debt financing, discretionary federal funding, and cordon pricing. So all these things are either in development or are being used in individual projects up to this point. Are there any comments on any parts of the financial plan? And again, we're giving you a flavor here, an overview, but there's a lot more detail. It's actually in Chapter 5 of the plan. If you go to the web portal, you'll see some of that detail in summary form, and you'll be able to access Chapter 5 also. Okay, moving on. There are required special elements in the plan. We're just going to give you an overview here. There's really too much detail here to go into tonight, but these are available for you to look at. These are all required by federal regulation, including a pedestrian bicycle element, a coordinated public transit human services transportation plan, a regional freight element, An environmental justice and Title VI assessment, that would be Title VI under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Environmental mitigation and new consultation has to do with protected areas and environmentally sensitive areas. All these are appendices to the plan, and they are required under the federal regulations to be included in the plan. We could easily do a session on each one of these, frankly, but they're there if you want to. If you're interested in any of these areas and you want to look further into them, they're available through the website, and you can provide comments on any parts of the plan, including these. Next slide. There are also a number of recommended projects, programs, and studies in the plan. These are above and beyond the actions and strategies that we've already talked about, but they're within the framework of the plan. And we're going to show you how they're identified in the plan by going through that link, Jessica. So there are, on the web portal, there is a map which shows the recommended projects, programs, and studies. You can hover over individual parts, individual lines and or icons, and get metadata about what the project is that's recommended and so forth. Additionally, underneath that are listings of all the projects. Some of them are, in fact, in the constrained plan. They're part of the portion of the plan that was identified to be within that anticipated resources. And part of them are they're visionary, speculative projects that are not yet within the financially constrained plan, but are identified as potential future needs should funding become available. There are literally several hundred projects identified, projects, programs, and studies identified in the plan. Again, we won't have time to go through them in any kind of detail, but they are out there. If you want to go through the web portal, you can view them for your area or for the region as a whole. Also contained in that section are coordinated development emphasis areas, which are basically areas where transportation and land use are being tied together, where growth is desired given transportation capacity improvements. And hopefully they are providing a framework for the transportation projects and a way to be more efficient in our region in terms of how the region is developing. And then finally, there are detailed descriptions which are required of the major metropolitan transportation investments. If you think back to the slide in the financial chapter section, those itemized major investments need to have a certain level of detail in the plan, and that's all provided in this section also. Next slide, Jessica. And last but not least, there is a congestion management process status report that accompanies the plan. It's not part of it, but we release it with the plan. We can go to the next slide. We'll go through this quickly. NMTC's planning area meets the definition of a transportation management area, and therefore we have to systematically forecast traffic congestion in the planning area, produce specific performance measurements and to identify levels of congestion, and prepare a program to reduce that congestion. And that is NMTC's congestion management process. But I want to point out that the program to reduce the congestion is in fact contained in the plan. This is not another level of recommendations, but rather the recommendations in the plan. There's a subset that are specifically focused on congestion mitigation. Next slide. So we publish the CMP status report with each new regional transportation plan, and that report provides an overview of the CMP and its methodology, as well as the results of the most recent CMP analysis and forecasts. And it also describes the strategies committed to in the plan to address current and forecasted levels of congestion. And that CMP status report is also accessible through the web portal. Next slide. There are a number of performance metrics, which we won't go through in detail here, that are related to congestion management and congestion mitigation. You see them here. And the next slide shows again that the analysis in the CMP status report uses some of the same peer region comparisons that we've talked about earlier in the presentation. Next slide. It also forecasts conditions at the individual county and borough level. On the left here, we have daily vehicle miles of travel. On the right, daily vehicle hours of delay. The blue bars for each county and borough are the base year conditions, which is 2019, and the reddish bars are the forecasted conditions for 2015. So there is also that look at the county and borough level, and then more detailed within each county and borough. We have the next slide, which is a county borough or a county level congestion analysis, including forecasts, identification of current bottlenecks, and general description of the key congested corridors in each jurisdiction, in each county and borough, as well as forecasts of future conditions. Next slide. Finally, the CMP status report contains congestion mitigation strategies and system enhancement investments. That first bullet is the one thing that's unique to the status report. It's a toolbox, a generic toolbox of strategies that can be considered in the planning process to mitigate congestion. And then in addition to that, we have the relevant goals, objectives, strategies, and actions from moving forward, and the system enhancement investments program in moving forward, and the federal fiscal years 2020 through 2024 transportation improvement program. So those are all contained in the congestion management process status report. So we're actually at the end here, and if there are any additional comments that anyone wants to provide, this is the time to do it, either in the chat pod or in this particular slide. And if not, we are going to tell you quickly about the schedule moving forward. Next slide. So we are in the comment period, which opened on June 28th and will close on July 27th. On August 19th, our Program Finance and Administration Committee will meet to recommend the final draft plan and the CMP status report to our full council for their adoption. That council meeting, which would be the commissioners and the elected and appointed officials that we heard about in the video, will meet on September 9th to adopt the final draft plan and the CMP status report. And then those documents will be formally transmitted to the federal oversight agencies. The next federal fiscal year begins on October 1st, and we hope to have these documents in place with federal approval in time for the next federal fiscal year, so the planning process can continue at pace and resources can continue to be used for transportation improvements in our region. And Jessica, is there one more slide after this? Yes, so this is the last slide. We certainly appreciate your attention tonight and your attention going forward. Any comments you provide, the input is greatly appreciated. We need to keep the plan grounded in what's happening in the region. Certainly all the public input we've collected during this entire planning process. It's been very important to the ultimate development of the plan. So we certainly appreciate your willingness to be with us tonight. Any last words from Jessica?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, to view the full plan or any of the appendices and executive summaries, just visit nimtic.org/plan moving forward and provide your comment by July 27th. And thank you for attending today's meeting.
Great. And again, thanks from here also. Have a good evening this evening, and everyone, please stay safe. Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.